Boethius is a 5th to 6th century writer. We are concerned with book 5 of his book called The Consolation of Philosophy. This book is written whilst he's in prison. He's awaiting execution for treason, and he takes up a number of themes in the book, but the one we're most concerned with is the problem of God's omniscience and free will and his punishments and whether they're just, which I'll discuss in a moment. But keep in mind that if you are to read his book, it's written as a dialogue between this character, Lazy Philosophy, and he's consoling himself and talking through ideas that he's concerned with, most notably that good people seem to suffer in this world, whereas bad people seem to prosper. So the problem, in his own words, if we look at this quotation from Book 5, The Consolation of Philosophy, so he says, "There seems to me to be such incompatibility between the existence of God's universal foreknowledge, so God being able to see into the future, and that of any freedom of judgment, so free will. For if God foresees all things and cannot in anything be mistaken," so we think God is infallible and his knowledge is perfect, "which his providence sees will happen, must result." So if God has to know everything and his knowledge can't be wrong and he knows the future, then how far can we say that we are actually free? So he continues, "If it knows, God, beforehand, not only men's deeds, but even their designs and their wishes, there will be no freedom of judgment. For there can neither be any deed done nor wish formed, except as such the infallible, so no errors, providence as God have foreseen." He's grappling with, and what you need to be able to assess is how far has he been successful in solving this issue. So if God has foreknowledge, do we have free will? Because if he knows what's going to happen in the future, then how can we have free choice? If he already knows what's going to happen, does his knowledge somehow kind of cause what's going to happen? And if we don't have free will, and so we haven't freely chosen good or bad things, then is God just? Is it fair to reward or punish us for the things that we didn't choose to do? So Boethius is relevant. You need to have a good understanding of him from the nature of God topic, because he can have his own question, critically assess or evaluate Boethius, or they might phrase a question and not mention him, but they are wanting you to discuss him, and that's about should God or does God reward and punish justly? Or he's relevant to any question about God's omniscience or eternity, because his solution is about a problem that involves both of those attributes. So these are the steps that he takes, and it's useful to sort of have these steps written down and to test yourself on how well you understand him by being able to elaborate and explain each of the steps. And it's important because each of the steps are needed for his solution to make sense. So I'm going to go through these steps, elaborate on them, and what I would suggest that you do is when you're trying to test yourself, you go back to these steps and you try and do it for yourself. So the first step is about the nature of the knower. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, okay, to understand whether God's knowledge of the future causes the future to happen and so we're not free, we need to understand his nature, because he argues that it's the nature of the thing which dictates what it has knowledge of and the effects of that. So for example, if you look at the t-shirt on the right, that picture, if you don't understand binary, you won't understand that maths joke. But if you understand it, and you understand binary, that 1 and 0, rather than 10, 1 and 0 means 2, then that t-shirt makes sense, and so it's a maths joke. So your nature of whether you understand binary or not dictates what you have knowledge of, whether you understand that joke. So this is what Boethius is saying. Your nature dictates what you have knowledge of and the effects of that knowledge. So he says in the quote underneath that he believes he's shown that knowledge is not based on the thing known but on the nature of the knower. So Boethius says that God's nature is eternal, okay, and he says For us to understand what we mean by eternal, we compare it with things that aren't eternal, temporal things, things within time like us. And he says, so temporal things, things within time, can't embrace the entirety of their existence. They cannot gather their past, present and future all at once. They live in the present and they can reflect on the past, but they do not yet know their future. So God is different. God is eternal. So what that means is they can do what temporal things can't. They can possess all of their life, their past, present and future, because they are not within time. So once he's established now that the nature of God is as an eternal being, which means that it can possess the entirety of its life, past, present and future, that therefore means that it has knowledge of a simultaneous present. All of the Earth's happenings, the world's happenings from the Big Bang to however the world ends, are all simultaneously present, because it's not like a temporal being going from its past to its present and moving to its future. It's all happening simultaneously. So if that's what his knowledge is of, then his knowledge is of a simultaneous present. So he's seeing not what we've done or what we're going to do, but he sees what we are doing, but all at once. And this is what I always say, do not try and imagine what that is. We cannot, by the very nature of us, understand what this means, as in a visual way. What we try to do when we try and understand something is visualize it. And then what ends up happening is you try and visualize a simultaneous present, okay, everything happening all at once in God's knowledge. You will feel that you don't understand Boethius, but you can't understand it because you're within time. So just try and understand Boethius' idea. Please try and stop yourself trying to visualize it, because you'll get stuck and you'll get confused. So because he's eternal and he can possess everything simultaneously, he therefore has knowledge of a simultaneous present. So he is seeing everything that we are doing. So this means that that's what God sees and he has knowledge of. So God is not seeing into our future. He's not here with us looking into our future. He's seeing what we call the future happening now, at the same time as what we call the past happening now, all as one simultaneous present. So if God sees, therefore, as a simultaneous present, and he has knowledge of this simultaneous present, does that still mean that he's causing it to happen? Because we haven't quite fully sort of got God off the hook of causing our actions, and therefore we're not free. So what he does is he uses an analogy. Okay, so what we have to be aware of course, analogies are limited, but this is the way that Boethius is trying to get us to understand. So he asks us to imagine a man walking, and there is a hill behind him, and there is a viewer on the hill. Now he says, as the man is walking, and I'll just show you the picture to help you see this. So we've got God, the viewer on the hill, that's the analogy there, and we've got this person walking. Now at that time, the walker is walking, it's necessary. If he stopped walking, he wouldn't be walking, but he is walking because that's what he's doing. So what God is seeing, or what the viewer is seeing, is the man walking, and so him seeing it isn't causing the walker to walk. The walker is walking because he's chosen to do it, and it's happening in that viewer's present. And in the same time, we've got the sun shining, but the sun is shining not because it's choosing to do it, but because it's the nature of the sun to shine. And so what Boethius says is these two things are happening, and they are necessarily happening because they're happening. And so God seeing it, it's a necessary thing of what God sees. So in the same way, when we act, we are doing things that then become a necessary part of what God sees, because what God sees can't be wrong. But what's different between the sun and the walker is that the walker is choosing to walk, whereas the sun is part of its nature, and he calls that simple necessity. It's necessary happening as part of his nature, whereas he calls the walker and the walker's actions that are freely chosen conditional necessity. So they are necessarily happening, but only because they are chosen. And the way I think of it is on the condition that they're chosen. So if we see this whole entire thing as like God's knowledge, God has knowledge of a simultaneous present. So what he sees is like this scenario. Some things happening of simple necessity, some things happening because they're chosen. And Boethius asks a really interesting question. He says, why would we ask and assume that God seeing things in his eternal simultaneous present happens of necessity, i.e. he causes it to happen, but in our own kind of lives, when we see things happen in our present, we don't think we cause it. So if we're saying that God sees everything in an eternal present, then he doesn't cause it to happen. In the same way, we don't cause the things that we see in our present. So God seeing it doesn't cause it to happen, but those things are necessarily happening because they are being chosen. So it's in our future, but it's not in the future to God, because he is seeing everything all at once. So therefore, what we can see is because God sees everything in an eternal present, he doesn't cause it to happen. He's just not waiting for us, because he's not within time. We've got to wait for our future because we're within time, whereas God is seeing everything simultaneously. And some of those things happen because it's the nature of it, like the sun, or some of those things happen because they're chosen to happen. And that's because they are freely chosen and they have conditional necessity. So therefore, because God isn't causing things to happen that he sees in his simultaneous present, we are therefore responsible for the choices we make, and God can freely reward and punish, and he is just in doing that. Now, when you're trying to evaluate Boethius, there are two kind of main strands to criticisms. One, that his idea is incoherent. This idea of a simultaneous present doesn't make sense. Then the other implication of his theory is that some people say the implications of his idea of the viewer on the hill and God being outside of time has sort of negative implications about the nature of God. And those sorts of people like Swinburne, would argue that actually God is everlasting rather than timeless. So if you remember when you studied God is eternal, there are two understandings of what it means to say that God is eternal. One, that he's timeless, like Boethius would say, that he is unchanging. And the other one is that God is everlasting, that he changes and he goes within time, and that's people like Swinburne. So one of the things that you can do in your evaluation is say, well, the solution to the problem is different if you change the idea of what it means to say God is eternal. So you don't have to go with Boethius' solution. So Anthony Kenny argues that the whole idea that Boethius presents of all of time being simultaneous present to God is incoherent. Now, Boethius might argue in response to that, well, that's just because you're within time, and because you can't, visualize it and understand it doesn't mean that that's not how it is. It's just because we have finite temporal minds that we cannot comprehend it. Now, other people have said, well, really the idea of the God that he presents seems to be that he's very transcendent and he's impersonal and he can't intervene because he's just a viewer and he's seeing things simultaneously present. And is that the God of the scripture? God of the scripture seems to be intimately involved with his creation. He acts, he responds to people. If we think about the religious experience and miracles unit, he seems to be almost acting within time, and that doesn't seem to correlate with both his idea. And people who would argue that God is everlasting for these sorts of reasons, that God is within time and there's not a problem with him changing, would be people like Richard Swinburne and Nicholas Vorsterstoff. So Richard Swinburne would say that actually God is everlasting, and for him to be in a relationship with us, he needs to be within time. And very similar with Nicholas Vorsterstoff, he said God being the Redeemer, the one who's helping us to be saved, he is all part of a succession of events and him intervening. So saving the Israelites and giving us the Ten Commandments and sending Jesus, they suggest that he acts within time. And if you take an everlasting view of God, then you don't really have the issue of God knowing the future. Because if he's within time, then he doesn't know the future. And so him knowing the future isn't an issue, because he doesn't. He actually just knows what is possible for him to know. And so you don't have the issue of him knowing the future and then him causing events to happen. So you might in your essay argue that a better solution is to change the nature of God to being everlasting, because then you avoid the problem completely. So it's important to know some strengths of an idea. I always would use the strength before and acknowledge the strengths before I would criticise something. And I think his comparison with our present is useful, because if I consider the things I see in my present, so at the moment, for example, my cat is desperately trying to get my attention because I've got the laptop out, I'm speaking, and she wants to be the focus of my attention, but I'm seeing it, but I'm not causing it to happen because I'm seeing it. She's still freely choosing to do that, and I'm not causing it to happen because I'm seeing it. So it kind of makes sense then, if we think that God is seeing everything as an eternal present because he's outside of time, then why would we think he causes things he sees in his present when we don't think we cause things when we see them in our present? It also maintains God's unchanging and simple nature, which many traditional theologians would want to emphasize. And also you can argue that it allows God to be fully omniscient. So because God is timeless and he is knowing everything that's happening past, present and future, we're not limiting his knowledge. Whereas if you take the idea of God being everlasting and not knowing the future, some people might argue that that's limiting God, whereas our idea of God is that he should be infallible and he shouldn't be changing and he shouldn't be gaining knowledge, because that means that he lacks something in the first place.